1 Edward 1029, copy, threatening traffic.
Copy, moving route.
Edward 1029, if you can please respond to 2020 McNeil Street, Lake.
Copy. If you still have run on, give the ATO information first.
Welcome to Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey. I'm Brad Carlyon, your Navajo County attorney, and my partner is Sheriff Casey Clark. Casey, good afternoon.
How you doing, Brad?
I'm doing great, and we got a wonderful show again this month. Our guest this month is Commander David Sargent with the Pinetop Lakeside Police Department, and Stephanie, the Executive Director of the White Mountain Safe House. When we have the two of you, we know we're talking domestic violence because you are two of the top experts in that area up here on that subject. And what I understand that we're going to talk about in this show is a new risk assessment tool the two of you have designed that Pinetop Lakeside PD is going to implement come July of 2015. So tell us, what is a risk assessment and why are you guys using one now?
So a risk assessment is a series of questions that specifically first responders can use whenever they are responding to domestic violence calls to be able to not only assess for themselves the level of danger that this victim may be in, but to help the victim to identify the level of danger that they're in as well. So it's this specified list of questions that they utilize when they go out on these domestic violence calls, and they're able to essentially get this victim to be able to connect with a victim service provider very promptly and efficiently and be able to get them follow-up services. So helping them with planning for their safety, both immediate and in the future. So that way, the ultimate goal is to reduce domestic violence, assaults, and fatalities in Navajo County, and specifically with the Pinetop Lakeside Police Department as we get this moving forward and hopefully expand it to other departments as well.
You talked about a range of risk. What kind of range are you talking about? How big is that continuum?
It's very, there's so many different aspects to identifying someone who is at high risk of having a serious assault or possible homicide or fatality in an abusive situation. So it can be something as minor. Some of these questions are, has he or she, meaning their abuser, their perpetrator, have they ever tried to kill themselves? That right there can be a trigger for future violence, attempts to commit suicide by the perpetrator themselves, or threatening to even kill themselves. Have they ever been constantly jealous, or do they control most of your daily activities? Again, these are minor things. There's not an assault that they're asking about, but they're asking about behaviors that ultimately can contribute to higher risk categories for victims. But even more so, on the other side of the spectrum is, have they ever threatened you with a weapon or actually used a weapon against you? Have they ever tried to choke or strangle you? Those are at the higher end of the spectrum of future violence, and how indicative it is that this is a pattern that is developing here. And what it's ultimately going to lead to is going to be much worse. And it shows the victim kind of how they can identify within their own relationship, because a lot of times victims don't necessarily identify some of these things as being abusive or characteristics of future abuse. So it's helping them to kind of connect those dots and get them connected with those service providers that can also help them in identifying these potentially dangerous factors in their relationship, so that way they can ultimately get safe and get out of that situation.
One of the big buzzwords in the criminal justice system is evidence-based practices. As you and Commander Sargent came up with this form, how did you determine that these are truly indicative questions of potential future behavior? What is your reliability basis?
Well, that's a good question. When Stephanie's the one who originally approached me with this. Safe House is in our area. We have a close relationship with them, and she went back and found that this program is actually in place in Connecticut, and they've been running that program for several years now. They've been looking at years and years of data, And I believe in a conversation that we had just this morning, there's been about a 33%. You know, it's hard to find a definite number, but the numbers that we looked at when we were looking at this program, about 33% of the people that we're having contact with in Connecticut are going through and getting a safety plan and getting themselves out of the situation that they were in. One of the statistics that we went over in the last conference was that it sometimes takes a woman or whoever it is that's being abused in the situation up to 10 times to try to leave the situation that they're in. And a lot of that is the fact that they don't recognize the situation that they are in. So I don't know how well that answers the question that you just posed, but there's several studies. We just got emailed another one that's a 109-page study of the data that they've collected since this program started, and that's where we got the 33 to 35% number of people they've actually been able to remove from situations where if they would have stayed in that situation, pretty good probability that they would have been seriously assaulted if not killed.
Do the two of you plan on keeping data to track how well this program is going to be working in the Pinetop Lakeside area?
Absolutely. Yes, we have an internal database system at the shelter where we'll be able to track not only how many of these assessments are being conducted, but ultimately try and get the same type of statistics that Connecticut has gotten. Their statistics since 2012 are that out of all of the individuals that they covered, it was about 2,500 individuals that they interacted with at these DV calls. 52% of those that were questioned were deemed high risk based on this questionnaire. And out of that 52%, 78% of them actually got on the phone right then and there on the scene with a victim service provider. Out of that 78%, 80% followed up services. So they continue to get that service from that victim service provider, whether that's shelter services or continued support as they go through the criminal justice system or being able to ultimately get safe and out of that abusive situation. And those numbers are amazing, you know, to be able to go from some of the purported numbers were only 4% were reaching out to victim service providers, up to 78% were being connected with victim service providers. That's pretty amazing.
Dave, have you gone over to any of the other PDs and shown them this or done any training on this at a local level?
You know, as Brad mentioned, I teach out at the Academy, the domestic violence block. The new recruits, we had Stephanie and we went over this lethality assessment, and that's an excellent question. I think that once we see, one of the reasons that we only started with one agency with this is that depending on how many DV calls we have, we could overrun the resources that are available to handle those calls. So we're wanting to do this in increments. All of our officers will be trained with this, and to point to that question, when officers come out of the academy, you know, I remember back when I first started, I was young, I had only been married for a couple of years, and to walk into a domestic violence situation that had been ongoing in someone's house for maybe years and had 20, 30 years of life of experience on me, they're going to listen to me? I mean, I could see that there was something wrong here and something was going to go bad if this continued, and we talk about the cycle of violence. But you'd give these questions to a new officer who really has even no experience in responding to domestic violence, and based on someone that you're interviewing, they give you the answers yes or no. An officer can actually take this and say, I want you to look at how you answered these questions. And based on those answers, we've got a big concern for your safety. Before we go, can we get you on the phone with the domestic violence advocate? And that's the number that Stephanie was alluding to, that 78% of those people before they left the call in Connecticut had people on the phone. So in a new officer's perspective, that's like, oh, okay, we've got them some help right now, and maybe we won't be back out here next week, and maybe this won't be.
How does this new way you're going to handle domestic violence calls in Pinetop Lakeside differ from how you and the other agencies do it now?
Well, right now, out of the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board, which you're aware of, which we sit on, Stephanie, all the players at the table devised a pamphlet. And what that pamphlet did was a very good resource beyond what we were doing before. giving them numbers to local people that could help them with their problem. What this does is all of those questions are on that pamphlet, but it's kind of up to those people whether they're going to ask themselves those questions. What this does is it says, if you've got a minute, I would like, again, voluntary cooperation. I'd like to ask you some questions if you're good with that might help you. Now those people we're engaging them on those questions that are on the pamphlet, and if they answer yes to one of 3 questions that are actually pretty serious in nature, or they answer yes to a series of the questions below, before we leave, we're not just giving them the pamphlet with these on them, we're actually putting them on the phone to someone who can start that safety plan right now. And so it's really, we're helping them take that first step in their safety plan.
And just for our audience to know, the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board is a group of people from a broad spectrum, from law enforcement to domestic violence shelters, judges, defense attorneys, the faith-based community, that looks at a couple domestic violence fatality cases every year just to see what was done right and what was done possibly wrong to try to improve the system. So what you're saying is this kind of came out of that?
Yes.
It did, and I can't tell you enough that it's good that we have our own here in the county. Because if we draw on what other boards are doing in other states, it doesn't fit into what it is that we're doing here, and we really don't know how to improve service. When I sat down on our first one and saw our strengths and weaknesses, it empowered me to change things in the way that we do business. I think it was an eye-opener to everybody at the table reviewing homicides that happened in our county. How do we improve services? Because what's happening in another place may not be what is exactly what we need here right now.
Stephanie, Commander Sargent mentioned a concern if we spread this too quickly, overwhelming your agency. These calls can come in 24/7. How do you man the phones 24/7 with your limited staff?
Well, we do have a 24/7 staff on site that are both there to provide assistance to our shelter victims, but they also man our 24-hour hotline. So we get regular calls coming into our hotline, but not being able to really anticipate how this is going to impact our hotline, we're wanting to take some smaller steps before we just branch it out everywhere. So as we get this incorporated with Pinetop Lakeside PD, we do have grand scale dreams of really taking this countywide eventually. That's the ultimate goal, is to make it a countywide option and service that law enforcement provides.
And you know, the good news about that is that we're not going to have to run this program for 6 months to figure out what the load on their system is going to be. I would think a month into it, we could assess, okay, how many calls do we have this month, and how much did that tie you up? And if that looks like an average picture out of our year, maybe we jump someone on the very next month who's ready and wants to be up to speed and wants to provide this service.
Commander Sargent talked about the training he's doing in the law enforcement community on using this assessment tool. Is there special training that you're now giving to expand your call receivers to help them understand when the calls come in on this,
Yes.
how maybe to change how they've been handling those calls?
Yes, we will have a specific protocol for these types of calls. Again, most of the calls that are coming into our shelter are actual shelter requests, people who are at the point of requesting shelter to come in. These may not fall under that category. At this point, they're just getting on the phone with someone to get that safety planning information, and it's looking like it's going to be a brief 5 to 10 minute phone call on average to be able to have that interaction with them, make a connection between our service provider as well as the victim, so that way we establish that relationship with them, and ultimately, hopefully, we'll get some follow-up services with them, whether that is shelter or even non-residential services and support. So yes, we will have our own internal protocol that is based on specific prompt safety planning over the phone to be able to fully assess how they answered this questionnaire, and then thus give them information and education to keep themselves safe and identify why these are huge risk factors for themselves as well in that phone call that we have with them.
So how many phone calls do you get now, a week or a month? Or?
Well, on average, let me sum it up in a year. We get about 500 crisis calls a year. So that averages out to about 1.5 a day. So I don't predict with just this agency bump that we're going to get a huge surge, but I don't want to assume either. Right. So we're going to take that baby step, but at the same time, as Commander Sargent mentioned, we're going to know very quickly how this is going to impact us. And so we're looking at moving forward very quickly and being able to get other agencies on board and ultimately possibly partner with other service providers as well to maybe help to balance out from the different law enforcement departments across the county to help to, handle those calls as they come in.
Yeah, because White Mountain Safe House seems to take the southern part of the county in Apache County, while Alice's Place seems to have the northern part.
Right.
Have you reached out to Teresa and Alice's Place about this?
Not as of yet. We briefly talked about it at our last Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board meetings, but we had not moved forward in making certain arrangements for that. But I think they would be open to it. I just don't know if they necessarily have the manpower to handle that as well.
It might be good to reach out as soon so they can figure out how they can handle the extra calls if they do come in based upon this program.
Absolutely.
Say it's not your typical domestic violence, a husband-wife at home, but more of a teen dating. Would you still use this in a teen dating situation?
Absolutely. We would still ask the questions, and we would still, depending on how old that adult was or that child was in a teen dating situation, we would want to talk to parents and bring them in on that as well. And I think that Stephanie would agree. We've had a couple good talks about the laws that have been passed that now cover dating relationships. Those fall under the domestic violence purview. And if we're going to do assessments for others that fall under that, then we should also be doing them with our teens, we believe.
So will the questions stay the same, or will they be slightly modified if it's a teenage dating violence situation?
Right now, the questions are the same, but some of them obviously don't apply. We see the same control factors in a dating relationship. For instance, this one, do they control most of your daily activities? A lot of people that are in danger in domestic violence as a dating relationship have an overbearing partner that tracks their every move throughout the day. And so I think that a lot of the questions would stay the same. Some of them may need to be altered, like this second one, has he threatened to kill you or your children? The children would obviously be left out if they don't have children in common. But the threat is still there. Has he ever threatened to kill you?
So what are some of the big issues that you're training officers and the service providers to look for that are real red flags of high risk?
Well, the first three questions are real big red flags, and until we put the pamphlet together, I don't know that I'd ever seen those ever presented anywhere before. But the top three questions are: has he ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a weapon? Has he threatened to kill you or your children, or do you think he might try to kill you? Someone doesn't have to have a threat made, depending on what the behavior in the house is, to feel in danger that may happen one day. And as a new officer responding out on the street to a domestic violence, without that pamphlet that we're all using now, without these specific questions being pointed and asked to someone who wants to volunteer that time to answer those questions, it's a lot more difficult to allow someone to see the danger that they are or could be in, because you can't articulate sometimes that sixth sense that we talk about in law enforcement, or there's just something not right here. And this allows us to say, well, according to your answers, this is what's not right. And in our experience and based on the studies that have been done in Connecticut, we think that maybe you should be talking to somebody else about this as well, that has more expertise in the field of resolving the problems. We're here to, when we arrive on scene, to keep peace, make sure nobody else gets hurt, and to put people in connection with services that can help them after we've left. And this we're getting them on the phone before we leave.
One of the other things that's good about this is when we started it was that it's also documented, so when you go back there a third, fourth time, it's good for the prosecution then also, because they can come back and they've answered this, because most of these domestics you go back repeatedly.
Yeah.
And so it's a good way to document
And based on that comment right there, we changed our form. We changed our form so that when we're asking these questions, they know this form may come up later in a prosecution. And in Connecticut, when they started that, they weren't advising those people of that. And it's important that they know that anything that you disclose to us as law enforcement on scene, it is going to have to be documented and go forward from there.
Because as a prosecutor, I know our biggest frustration is the recanting that they do. So we really like it when the officer can get a recorded statement. So if they do recant, we can play that statement of the victim in the court for the judge, or at least a written statement. So if they try to change their story, we can say, this is what you said at the scene at the time, and now what you're saying.
And this is why sometimes it takes somebody 10 times to leave, is from the time of the assault or whatever it had happened in their home. Now we're into the honeymoon phase, as you guys know about, in the cycle of violence, or maybe we're into a threatening and intimidating portion where, we're not going to want to go to court and say.
It's a very tough situation for everybody involved, and the scary part is, having been a prosecutor for 25 plus years, it seems to be something that's carried on from generation to generation, either as the victim for typically a young girl growing up in a domestic violence household, to a perpetrator for a young man who sees this as normal behavior between a husband and wife.
Right. Yeah, it almost, when you grow up in that type of household, it's essentially kind of setting you up for one or two paths, either growing up to take on those abusive characteristics or those victim characteristics and choose those abusive partners later in life.
And we seem to be seeing it playing out more in the high school level and the teen dating situations, which is why at this year's Victim Rights Conference, that was the big topic in our teen leadership, and we had them do videos and posters on it to help educate themselves better that it's not a normal relationship, and you need to speak up and talk about those situations.
Absolutely. You know, they're learning a lot at home too about what does love look like, what is a healthy relationship, and they may be getting mixed messages from peers, from their family, and so they're using that information to form what they believe is to be an okay relationship. And so that teen dating violence is huge. It's really taking off in the schools, and just in general with adolescents. They're dealing with these adult issues of controlling and abusive behaviors.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for being our guests this month. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and especially thanks to you both for your very active involvement in the domestic violence, from serving on the Fatality Review Board to teaching at our academies and just educating the public as a whole.
Well, thank you
again
for the time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
And that's it for this month of Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey. And after this brief message, we'll come back with Casey's Most Wanted for the month. Thanks very much.
Parents, don't let teens take prescription drugs from your medication cabinet. Dispose of unwanted and expired drugs at a drug drop box near you. For locations, visit www.navajocountyaz.gov.
The Navajo County Sheriff's Office and County Attorney's Office are working with the Office of the Attorney General in locating and apprehending Mary Gonzalez. She is possibly in the Holbrook area, but also resides in the Phoenix area. She is currently wanted by the Office of the Attorney General for allegations of fraudulent schemes. She has a history of venerable adult abuse and currently has a warrant for her arrest. If she is seen, please contact your local law enforcement agency and do not approach her, or contact WeTip at 1-800-78-CRIME. That's 1-800-782-7463.